Although we haven't seen any notable disruptions or attacks related to elections, violence is still likely before and after the elections.
Hello and welcome to episode 58 of What's Happening in Myanmar, a weekly show from the Frontier Myanmar podcast family. I'm your host, Luke Corbin. Today it's Friday, December 19. This is our final show for the year, and we'll be ringing out 2025 with an interview about the worsening civil war and the militarisation of society in Myanmar. In just a moment, I will introduce our guest, who is Su Mon, Senior Analyst for the Asia Pacific at the organisation Armed Conflict Location and Event Data. But first, let me cover two major developments in the news this week before we hear from Su Mon. First, 19 resistance groups announced on Tuesday they have formed a new alliance dubbed the Spring Revolution Alliance, SRA. This new SRA includes well-known and battle-hardened groups such as the Burma People's Liberation Army, the Karenni Nationalities Defence Force, and the Chin Brotherhood. It also includes other smaller groups across Sagaing Region, Magway Region, and Shan and Mun states. The new SRA coalition officially opposes military rule and aims to establish federal democracy in Myanmar. It says that it's open to even more revolutionary groups choosing to join its ranks. The announcement can be seen as the culmination of long negotiations between the 19 groups, first starting after the conclusion of the unprecedented Operation 1027, when a smaller number of groups floated the idea. At that time, many fighters from post-coup resistance groups were relocating or declaring their intention to relocate to pursue operations in the dry zone. The SRA claims it has around 10,000 fighters, which will now work under a centralised command system. The announcement, timed less than 2 weeks before the military's planned partial elections, sends a signal that the Spring Revolution, with its hundreds of disparate groups resisting military rule since 2021, well, that it is still alive and well. The alliance could lead to better bargaining power and coordination with the other older groups fighting for autonomy in Myanmar, like the Kachin Independence Army, the Karen National Liberation Army, and even the alternative post-2021 NUG, the National Unity Government. The SRA is independent of the NUG, but the NUG has welcomed the alliance's formation. Despite that rosy opening statement, the formation of this SRA alliance could further erode the credibility of the parallel administration, NUG. The NUG has, of course, faced criticism this year, has recently reshuffled its leaders, and several resistance groups abandoned the NUG's chain of command earlier in 2025. Then the NUG's mandate, stemming from its inclusion of members of parliament that were elected in the 2020 elections, also appears to be becoming less compelling over time. All of this, of course, will play out in 2026. And in the second development this week, a long-time non-violent peaceful protester has been detained in Mandalay. Activist Htet Myat Aung was apparently severely beaten when he was taken in by the military, and activist groups claim that his life is now in imminent danger. Htet Myat Aung is a former student union president and a member of the General Strike coordination body. People who know him have vouched for his integrity and commitment to non-violence. As a protester who resisted the 2021 coup and then refused to leave his home community of Mandalay, even as the military turned its guns on the people and increased its repression. Media outlet Democratic Voice of Burma reports that Htet Myat Aung was one of the protesters at the Zecho Market flash mob earlier this month, December 3. The military regime charged him and 9 other activists under the election protection law for conducting the demonstration, and also apparently offered cash rewards to the public in exchange for information on the protesters' whereabouts. The military regime's Minister of Home Affairs, Lieutenant General Tuntun Naung, said on Tuesday that 229 people have now been charged under the election protection law for, quote, attempting to sabotage election processes. Now, under this law, which was enacted in July, anybody found guilty of criticising or disrupting the elections faces huge sentences ranging from 3 years in prison to the death penalty for cases that involve violent actions. Vice Senior General Su Mon confirmed this week that the first phase of the military's controversial elections would take place in 102 townships, the second phase would be in 100 townships, and the third in 72 townships. The first phase is opening on December 28 as planned, the second on January 11, and the third will likely occur 2 weeks later on January 25. Now let me take a brief moment to remind you that Frontier is a subscription-based independent media organisation. We do feature stories, political analysis, daily briefings, media monitoring, panels and events, as well, of course, as our podcasts. Most of Frontier's expert journalism and content actually comes to you via email if you subscribe as a member. This holiday season, consider signing up or signing someone up that you know. Someone who needs to keep up with what's happening in Myanmar. Go to frontiermyanmar.net/memberships. And look, while you're on the website, why don't you take a peek at the latest video episode of our sister podcast, Do Atan. You'll see how some members of the civil disobedience movement that fled Myanmar are now turning to handicrafts and starting new small businesses to create a new future for themselves. Okay, now back to the show. Capping off another sad week of military atrocities and airstrikes on civilians, today I'm happy to welcome back ACLED's senior analyst for the Asia-Pacific, Su Mon. Just like we did at the end of 2024, we're going to pick Su Mon's brain about the year just past as seen through ACLED's conflict data and analysis. Hello, Su Mon.
Hello, Luke. Thanks for having me back on the show.
So very quickly, Su Mon, in a minute or less if you can, could you remind us what is ACLED exactly and what conflict data does it track in Myanmar?
I'm happy to start with ACLED, of course. So ACLED is the leading source of real-time data analysis on political violence and demonstrations worldwide. So ACLED monitors conflict in more than 200 countries and territories and records a wide range of political disorder types, demonstrations, armed clashes, arrests, attacks, and remote violence such as air and drone strikes and artillery shelling. It tracks full spectrum of conflict from peaceful protests to riots, communal clashes to large-scale military conflicts, identifying the actors driving political violence, where is political violence happening and how it's happening, and those more affected by it. So ACLED sources data locally and through partnerships, applying a transparent and comprehensive methodology so that enables comparison across different contexts. It is widely relied upon by policymakers, researchers and academics, journalists and humanitarian organizations.
So looking back, 2025, this year there were huge counteroffensives by the military. They're still ongoing. The military retook significant territory back from resistance groups, territory that it had lost in 2023 and in 2024. So how would you review conflict in 2025 based on your data and expertise and what came before?
Right. Unfortunately, Myanmar remains the second most violent country in the world after Palestine, according to the ACLED Conflict Index. So this index assesses and ranks the 10 most violent conflicts globally using 4 indicators. So Myanmar ranks first on the fragmentation indicator, reflecting the presence of hundreds of armed groups operating across the country. It also scores extremely high on other indicators as well. Deadliness, with over 90,000 people killed since the 2021 coup. Diffusion, with conflict spreading to 323 out of 330 townships. And danger to civilians, with approximately 90% of civilians have been exposed to conflict since the coup. And, civilians have increasingly been targeted by military airstrikes as the conflict has intensified. So, turning to developments in 2025, as you rightly noted, this year has been marked by major military counteroffensive. A notable trend throughout 2025 has been the military's intensifying use of air power and large troop deployments. Many reports reported that the military has adjusted its tactics and strategies to recapture territories previously lost to resistance groups. So these include tactical changes that allowed lower-ranking officers to call in strikes with more flexibility. This has been reported by a think tank called Myanmar Defense and Security Institute, MDSI, and it's also consistent with our own observations based on multimedia reporting. So these changes have enabled the military to conduct preemptive airstrikes to clear areas before launching ground assaults. So this year recorded the highest number of airstrikes since the coup, over 2,500 airstrikes carried out in 2025 alone. With support from China, India, Russia, and Belarus, the military has also strengthened both its drone fleet and its air defense system. It has procured thousands of customized commercial drones, including models with anti-jamming capabilities, and received technical assistance from these countries. So now infantry battalions are equipped with drones and counter-drone systems such as drone guns. So in addition, the military has also deployed paramotors and gyrocopters to bomb civilian gatherings and civilian infrastructure, mainly in central Myanmar. So now going back to the deployment of large number of troops. So military has deployed large number of conscripts in pitched battles against resistance groups. Conscription training began last year, and the military has now completed its 20th training batch. So with each batch consisting of approximately 5,000 conscripts, it is estimated that at least 70,000 conscripts have been used in counter-offensive operations. In several instances, resistance groups were forced to retreat after being surrounded by these thousands of troops, for example, during the military's recapture of sections of the Asia Highway in Kayin State. In parallel, the military has co-opted military ethnic militias to fight alongside it against resistance forces, particularly in major conflict hotspots. Another major trend I want to share is the shifting geography of the battlefield. Armed clashes between resistance groups and the military declined in 2025 compared to previous years, so especially in areas that experienced intense fighting over the past 4 years, such as the Sagai region. The Sagai, which borders Shan and Kachin states, recorded a 25% drop in armed clashes. However, this does not mean de-escalation. Instead, the battlefield has shifted southward in 2025, particularly to Eari region and Kayin state. So new battlefronts are opening in Eari region. But overall, the military's most significant achievement in 2025 has been its ability to neutralize the threat posed by Operation 1027. So during that operation, resistance groups captured 20 towns in northern Myanmar and threatened Pyongyang, a major military garrison town of Mandalay region, where the central military headquarters is located. The military was able to recapture some towns and compel the Kokand Army and the detained army. These are the key forces behind Operation 1027 to enter into ceasefires. This also effectively forced them to relinquish control of towns and weaken the broader resistance, by cutting off logistical supply routes, border assets, and intergroup connectivity. I would say these are major developments in 2025.
Thanks. Now, you actually recently published a conflict watch list report for Myanmar for the year 2026. These are annual reports that focus on likely changes in conflict dynamics in the coming year. So could you summarize that for us? What do you see ahead for conflict in Myanmar next year?
Thanks for drawing attention to my report. Looking ahead to 2026, we are likely to see increased political repression. The military is, organizing an election scheduled to run from 20 December through the end of January. So if our data is any indication, civilians in military control areas are more subjected to conscription. Civilians in areas where elections are held are likely to face heightened political repression in the post-election period. And the military already possess the tools to carry out such repression. So these include China assisted surveillance software, PSMS, population management system, which enables the collection and aggregation of detailed personal data. In addition, the military revoked several protections under the Privacy and Security of Citizen Protection Law during the state of emergency. But these provisions have not been reinstated despite the organization of elections. Repression has already intensified in the lead-up to the vote. According to the military's own statements, more than 200 civilians have been arrested for allegedly disrupting the elections under election protection law. Some individuals have received prison sentence of over 40 years for hanging posters opposing the vote. Many others have been arrested simply for posting or reacting on social media, while, some have been coerced into attending or participating in pro-regime rallies. So following the elections and throughout 2026, the military is likely to expand surveillance, arbitrary detention, and direct attacks on civilians suspected of resistance or dissent. And I think I'm responsible to also mention that dozens of resistance groups mentioned that they will not allow polls in their control areas. Although we haven't seen any notable disruptions or attacks related to elections, violence is still likely before and after the elections because the military will deploy armed or unarmed militias and conscripts during the elections under the name of security. In addition to that, 2026 is likely to see increased conflict between resistance groups and ethnic militias and between resistance groups and militants across many parts of the country. The military has not only expanded conscription domestically, but has also co-opted ethnic militias, foreign actors, and militant groups to fight alongside against resistance forces. So, for example, the Htet militia has increasingly found itself fighting resistance groups. At the same time, the military has reportedly armed and trained Rohingya armed groups based in refugee camps in Bangladesh. So these dynamics are unlikely to reverse, even if new political institutions, a civilian-fronted administration, or revised rhetoric after the elections emerge. For their part, resistance groups are likely to revert to tactics used prior to Operation 1027, widespread but lower intensity guerrilla warfare, sporadic attacks on convoys and military bases, and they are likely to open new battlefronts in areas where the military remains vulnerable. The setbacks experienced by resistance forces in 2025 are partly due to the absence of a unified political vision beyond the goal of anti-military rule, as well as weak coordination among armed groups. So many resistance groups remain focused on localized territory control rather than developing cohesive national strategies. There are emerging efforts toward greater coordination. These include the meeting between Kachin Independence Army, Kachin Army, and Chin Brotherhood, and many resistance groups based in Zagai in August, and then Arakan Army coordination with resistance groups in Bago, Magui, and Mandalay regions. And just recently, 19 resistance groups formed an alliance called Spring Revolution Alliance with the stated commitment to continue fighting until their objectives are achieved. So these developments suggest potential for renewed momentum, but without meaningful progress toward unifying common structure or shared political framework, major military breakthroughs in 2026 are likely to remain difficult.
Frontier Myanmar actually published a feature this week that's relevant about, how pressure from China has forced ethnic armies in Shan State to stop supplying arms and ammunition to resistance groups in the central dry zone. That's led to a scarcity of guns and ammunition, particularly among People's Defence Forces that are really struggling right now to hold their ground against the military. I wondered if you had read that article, and would you agree that this on-the-ground reporting is consistent with your observations in the data?
I do not recall a period in which resistance groups were able to assess arms and ammunition in abundance. Many fighters, particularly in the central drying zone, they do not possess firearms. They often said the enemy's gun is my gun, and that logic has motivated them, has driven them to raid on police stations and military outposts to seize weapons. And you may recall that People's Defense Forces, PDF, these groups continue to give the incentive for defections. So if military soldiers defect from the institution with the guns, they are offered financial rewards, which increase depending on the weapons they bring with them. So this policy still remains in place because it has been the cheapest way for resistance groups to acquire arms. This scarcity of weapons is in fact one of the reasons why many resistant fighters from the drying zone, particularly from Sagaing region, have traveled to Shan State to fight alongside the Kokang Army and the An Army during the Operation 1027. Their motivation hasn't been only, to gain battlefield experience, but also to obtain weapons. Even the resistance group operating in Gaya State, for example, border with Thailand, they also face the same problem. You might remember Granny resistance forces, they were unable to capture Loy Kot, the capital town of Gaya State, because they ran out of ammunition during the operation. Weapon shortages have plagued many resistance groups since at least 2023. But as you mentioned, the situation deteriorated further after Operation 1027 Phase 2, when the Kokang Army and An Army capture additional towns. Because in response, China shut down border gates controlled by resistance groups for several months, to exert pressure on them. This severely affected local communities, which, were unable to obtain even the basic necessary goods such as fuel and medicine, let alone weapons or dual-use items. Combined with depreciation of the jet, these restrictions have created acute shortages of critical supplies. Resistance groups are forced to rely on informal trade routes that passes through multiple areas of control. So China pressure on the United World States Army, that is another blow to resistant supply lines, making local procurement and smuggling even more difficult. One thing that related to conscription is that when the military introduced conscription, many resistance groups underestimated its impact. And they assumed that conscripts would defect in large numbers. They could not be trained effectively in a short period. And they would desert once fighting began. And in many cases, these assumptions have proven true, but resistance groups did not anticipate the increased cost of fighting in terms of ammunition. Even poorly trained conscripts require resistant forces to expand far more bullets from already scarce supplies to win, engagements. So this put extra additional strain on their limited resources.
Thinking about that, key territory is changing hands, has changed hands this year. But some battlefronts are still in a stalemate and, much the same as they were at the beginning of 2025. For example, we've got Bamor, Chaopiu, Sittwe. So how do you see these major conflict zones progressing in 2026?
These areas you mentioned are extremely difficult for resistance groups to capture. They are strategically very important and politically very significant. Control of Bamor will streamline logistical routes and facilitate trade and arms flow to resistance group, but that will also serve as an alternative supply route for Kachin Army. After China shut down border gates and they pay heavy price for that, they also need to diversify access corridors. And Bamor holds Military Operations Command 21. And its capture would enable Kachin Army to threaten Myitkyina, where the Northern Regional Command is located. all the analysis we have, how the military has changed its tactics, how it has been attacking the resistance group in 2025 are actually partly learned from the battle in Burma, because the military is attacking Burma with constant air and drone strikes, and even using advanced reconnaissance drones with thermal imaging capabilities. And military also thrown large-scale troops as well. Approximately 20 vessels carrying estimated 1,000 troops were deployed to reinforce military operations against the Kachin army in Burma. This is to say that it is not an easy fight, it's not a fair fight or easy fight for Kachin army, but this is also where we observe the military new tactics against these areas. But, despite suffering significant casualties, the KIA has not abandoned its objective of capturing Burma. And given that neither side shows signs of backing down, the fighting is likely to continue in 2026 for months. And same for Sittwe and Chaopyu, both coastal towns in Rakhine State. They also present similarly formidable challenges for the Arakan army. Access to these towns are highly constrained, with effectively a single-line approach from Ponajong to Sittwe and from Rambier Island to Chaopyu. The military has also deployed numerous naval vessels along the coast and has used naval artillery and shelling from ships and naval bases to deter advances. At the same time, the military has conducted lethal airstrikes in other towns under AA control to divert attention and slow down AA advances. But despite these obstacles, both Sittwe and Chaopyu are of immense political and strategic importance for both Arakan army and the military. They host multi-billion-dollar infrastructure projects, including China-backed oil and gas pipelines and India-supported multimodal transport projects. If the AA were to capture either town, it will gain significant leverage over both China and India, potentially compelling them to engage with the AA, as a de facto governing authority and regional partner. The military is therefore likely to take extraordinary measures to defend Sittwe and Chaopyu and prevent this outcome. It is also important to note that private security contractors and armed personnel are reportedly present in Chaopyu to protect Chinese interests. Depending on the extent of China's willingness to back the military, this could lead to direct confrontations between these forces and the AA as well. But in Sittwe, the risks to civilians are particularly acute. The town hosts large civilian populations, including both Rakhine and Rohingya communities, many of whom are IDPs. Any major military action against Sittwe would have severe humanitarian consequences for these civilians.
Yeah, the stakes really are very high in those three examples. Okay, last question. Thank you for your patience. Everything we've talked about so far, I would say, implies that society in Myanmar, it's only continuing to militarize, at a very broad level, all these new conscripts, everything we've talked about, basically. How do you think that conflict since the coup in 2021 is affecting society, culture, the prosperity of the country? What can be done to change this trajectory?
That's a good question, and I think it is also a difficult question for everyone to answer. So Myanmar society has endured immense suffering. In conflict-affected areas, countless people have lost their lives, homes, and livelihoods. According to UN reports, 1 in 3 people in Myanmar is now facing hunger. An estimated 13.5 million people have been displaced, and 19.5 million are in urgent need of humanitarian assistance. And this humanitarian crisis is compounded by, daily military airstrikes that target civilian infrastructure, including schools, hospitals, and clinics, and, social and cultural events, weddings, ethnic New Year celebrations, and religious festivals such as Light Festival have also been targeted. In some regions, repeated bombardment has become a routine. Under these conditions, there is little opportunity for communities to heal, to rebuild, to preserve, cultural traditions, or maintain social cohesion or sustain hope for the future. Perhaps the most dangerous long-term consequence of this prolonged violence is the deep social division produced by the militarization of society. These fractures will outlast the fighting and shape Myanmar's future in, profoundly damaging ways. The only way to change this trajectory is, through justice and accountability. Those responsible for atrocities, war crimes, and human rights violations must be held accountable, and they must not be allowed to hide behind elections or the rhetoric of restoring stability. Impunity guarantees the continuation of atrocities, so without accountability, the conflict will persist and the war will continue.
Okay, you've given us so much to think about there, Su Mon, over the holiday period. I really want to thank you so much for taking the time to prepare for and to deliver these thoughts after another year of closely watching the civil war and the fallout from the military's disastrous coup in Myanmar, which is now nearly 5 years ago. So thank you, Su Mon.
Thanks for having me. Have a nice day.
And that brings us to the close. I want to just say my appreciations to all the listeners who have stuck with this show throughout 2025. This podcast is still a work in progress, and there'll be an opportunity for more feedback, for you to give feedback overall about Frontier Myanmar in the new year. And feel free to make any suggestions you like about this show when you do that. It's been really a hell of a year for Burma, we can say. The billion-dollar scam industry grew, transformed. The military's political repression and violence only intensified. The resistance movement against military rule had victories and failures. There were fractures and new alliances. And on top of all that, the Sagaing earthquake rocked the nation, causing huge amounts of damage and opening the door for coup leader Senior General Min Aung Hlaing to start rubbing shoulders with heads of state in the region. And now the year is finishing with the military's so-called elections. I will be seeing you again in 2026. There'll be no episode next week. So a happy Christmas if you celebrate it. When we return in January, the elections will have begun in earnest, and Frontier members will have already received a bumper daily briefing newsletter summarising that first day of voting. I look forward to broadcasting again next year. And farewell and take care.